Just,
Oops, sorry, Husky. We're also going to be recording this webinar.
okay, yeah, we'll be recording this webinar, so you can, people who missed the training, or if you want to go back and review the training again, you'll be able to get that off the Native American Disability website. But this training is entitled Disability Sensitivity Training. And the presenters on this training are Cecilia Fred, who's on the board for the Native American Disability Law Center, Austin Moore, who's an attorney with the Law Center, and myself, Oscar Benali, and I'm the Community Government Liaison for the Law Center. So those are the three presenters. We'll have Cecilia introduce herself, and Austin, then myself.
Ya Shea Cecilia and Shiedo McKinley County Jishalan Red Rock Coliedo Ado ya Zanajin Shlon Hana ni Dashaja do to the chain Dashanala Yado La Center 8 House.
And good morning. My name is Austin Moore, and I'm a member of the Samish Indian Nation with ties to the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians on my mother's side. As Oski said, I'm an attorney with the Native American Law Center, and I thank you all for letting us speak with you today.
Good. And I'm Husky Benali Jr., and I'm the Community Government Liaison for the Law Center. Ashin and then was it cut sheet, she said that it over time. I should say that it doesn't matter. Though a such an is that she didn't that. Funny, so I don't educate. So want to say good morning again, and this webinar was really brought forth by, and back in 2011, we did a disability survey across the Navajo Nation with individuals with disabilities, with family members of individual disabilities, and disability service providers. But a majority of those who had disabilities indicated that one of the things, and we're asking them about NHA housing and public housing, and that's one of the areas that they identified is a major concern of theirs. And then some of those that had already applied for housing, they indicated that they felt that the NHA staff needed some disability sensitivity training in order to learn how to work with people with various types of disabilities. And so that came out of that survey back in 2011. And so we've been meeting with administration and Regina Charles Newton, Honorable Regina Charles Newton, and talking about some of the issues. And the sensitivity training came up and was requested by NHA. So that's why we're doing this training today. We'll be talking about various topics. I'll be talking about visual impairment, a little bit about hearing and disabilities, speech disabilities, and what they call hidden disabilities. Cecilia will be talking about mobility, disability, and Austin will be presenting on the various government, state, and Navajo Nation legal mandates for Navajos with disabilities. So we're scheduled from 9 to 12. Chances are that we might wrap up even before 12. So I want to thank Matilda and the administration of NHA for requesting and inviting us to provide this training. So I'm visually impaired. I have a degenerative eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa. I was born with it, and from the time that I was born up to age 22, I had night blindness. I couldn't see in dimly lit areas. I couldn't see at night, went outside. I was very sports minded, like play basketball, football, softball, baseball. But when you're in high school, they play in the gymnasium basketball, and I couldn't function as far as a player because of the dim lights. And then some of the football games were at night, so I didn't get the chance to participate. But at age 22, in a matter of 2 weeks, I lost a lot of my vision. At first, it was, in most cases, people with, they call RP, retinitis pigmentosa, they have tunnel vision. Their vision starts to close in on them. In my case, it was just the opposite. I lost my center vision. And I had some peripheral vision up to a certain point, then began to lose a lot of my vision. So up to this point in time, I have very much difficulty getting around by myself. So I can't read. I use a computer a lot. And so knowing about visual impairments, there's going to be individuals coming to NHA who may be visually impaired. And so visual impairment is, I guess it's a wide range from a minor visual impairment to a major visual impairment. Some of them can use aids like magnifying glasses or large print. They can read large print and are able to have enough vision to do that. Some of them have learned Braille and read Braille. In my case, I know a little bit about reading Braille, but mostly use the computer. To have a reader program called the JAWS program. And that program allows me to do whatever I need to do on my job. Read emails, send out emails, develop documents, go into the internet and view different documents on the internet. All these things that a person with that's visual can do. I can do basically most of it with the computer. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that that still I have problems with the use of the computer. So range of loss. So when you come up, somebody comes to the law center, I mean to the housing, he's probably going to notice that some of them can see, still kind of get around, and some can't. Okay. Being legally blind doesn't mean you're completely blind. The range is in a vision of 2070 to 2200. And the 2200 is really what a person who doesn't have a visual impairment, what they see at 200 feet away, a person who's a 2200 vision who's legally blind by definition, they have to get up 20 feet from that same object to be able to see what a person without visual impairment would see 200 feet away. So in 2070 is the same way. A person who's not visually impaired, but they see at 70 feet, a person with visual impairment up to 2070 has to get up 20 feet to be able to see the same object. So 2070 to 2200, that range there is being legally blind. But again, that doesn't mean that you can't have mobility on your own. And like in my case, I still had enough vision up to age 22, and even after for about a year, I still could get around a little bit on my own. And so that's the range that people look at for defining legally blind. when the individual comes into the office, ask them if they need assistance. Don't just go over there and start trying to help them the courteous way or ethical way or good etiquette is say, can I help you? What do you need help with? And then they'll tell you, this is what I need help with this, and give them that opportunity to give you that opportunity to provide assistance to them. And so there's legal aid, there's aids that they use, like I said earlier, there's Braille, there's magnifying glasses, large print. In some cases, some companies, they'll tape record things ahead of time that they know that a person who's visually impaired would need to know. In other words, maybe example, what is the application process? What is it? What does it do? What's expected? Maybe getting that on a tape recorder ahead of time. And maybe even your policies for individual with disabilities. So those are kind of some general things to think about. When you come up to a person who's visually impaired, and they can't see you, okay, like me, if somebody comes up in front of me and starts talking, I don't know if they're talking at me, okay? So usually the best way to do that is go up to that person and let them know you're there. Say, I'm so-and-so, and I'm here working with NHA. That way he knows, that person knows he's being talked to. Even in a group setting, it's the same way. If there's a group of people and the person who's visually impaired, maybe they're being talked to by whoever the instructor is or who's leading the group, but they don't know they're being talked to or asked a question or saying, well, what do you think? Best way to do is call them up by name. So what do you think, Hosky? Or Hosky, you got any comments? Because otherwise I don't know they're talking to me, okay? So be aware of that. When you're come up to somebody, introduce yourself, of course. And if you're with somebody else, say, I got Johnny standing beside me right here on my right side, and I got so-and-so standing behind me. And that way they know who's there with that person. And it gives them a more sense of who they're talking to and based on the introductions that have been given. When you speak to somebody with a visual impairment, speak to them. They might be with somebody who's helping them around, like my wife, okay? When we sit down to eat, and they notice that I'm visually impaired because she's leading me to the table. And they'll look at her and says, what does he want to eat? And my wife says, I don't know, he can talk, ask him. So a lot of cases, people will tend to speak to the person that's helping that person, or a caregiver or service provider. Speak to the person that's visually impaired, that's there for your assistance or seeking services from your organization. Speak to them, and then if he doesn't know, he'll then maybe turn it over to the person he's with and say, well, he knows more about it or she knows more about it. So make sure you speak to them and not to the other person first. Okay, and then like I was saying, when don't do anything until you offer the assistance and see what they say, give you the opportunity to help them. Some of them are use canes to navigate and to walk around with. Me, I never learned how to use a cane, and so I can get around, and I'm pretty familiar with an environment. Like here at the office, I'm pretty well know where things are and what to expect. But if I'm at somewhere else, then I'm totally lost. And give specific directions when you get to find people. You know, don't disappoint and say, lead, you know, don't, because they can't see. Some people, they'll say, you got a ink pen in front of you, or you have this in front of you, but in front of you is a wide range, okay? And so, like with meals, when we sit down to eat, and my wife tells me what they call the clock symbol, and she'll tell me what's on my plate. At 12 o'clock, which means on top of the plate, near the top of the plate, you have your bread right there. At 3 o'clock, your meat's right there. At 6 o'clock, your vegetables are right there. And then at 9 o'clock, maybe your soup's there. And then your coffee is sitting at 3 o'clock beside your plate. And it orientates me to know what's on my plate, where things are. And so we use that clock symbol. Same way, even you can use that in the office and say there's an ink pen right there at 6 o'clock. Or give them directions in that way. Also, let them know specifically when you're going to help them they say, okay, I need assistance to get to one place to another. Then they take you put out your arm and they hold you right above your elbow. Then you lead them, okay? And walk, let them set the pace, and then you walk that same pace. Sometimes my wife tends to drag me along, and I tell her, hey, slow down, you know, they're pulling me along. So, and then tell them there's a step coming up, or there's 3 steps, or we're going up a ramp. Because if I know that we're not going to hit, if I don't know we're going to go up a ramp, and I step on that ramp, sometimes they're steep, and I would tend to get startled or tend to something unexpected. Or she'll say, we're going to go up a ramp now. So she gives me what's ahead of me. We're coming to the door, okay? So that's some of the ways to help them and lead them. When you come to a stairs, say, even outside, maybe there's a long steps, maybe 10 to 12 steps, maybe 6 steps. There's usually a handrail alongside, or if it's inside upstairs, there's banisters. So when you get to that point, you say, well, we're going to go up some steps here. You get their hand and you put it on the rail, on the rail that they're going to be going up. For me, that gives me security. Okay, it's difficult for me just to walk up the steps and hold on to somebody. If I hold on to them and then I have that rail, I can feel we're going upward, and then when we get to the end of the top of the steps, I know because right there is where the rail ends. And then my wife says, well, we got some more steps coming up again. And then I know there's some more steps coming up, and then she puts my hand on the rail. And indoors, it would be on a banister. And so, and that provides, for me, like I said, it gives me security. And this helps me to feel. When you seat somebody, okay, they say, can you help me sit down? So you take them, you lead them over to that chair, and you get their hand and you put their hand on the back of the chair. That way they know which way the chair is facing, and they know where to sit down, okay? If I'm by myself sometimes, and they tell me there's a chair over there, and I find it, and then it's it's kind of difficult for me to try to find out which way the seat is. So in some cases, I'll start circling the chair and try to find the seat. But if you put their hand in the back of the seat, they know which direction the seat is and which direction the chair is facing. And it makes it more comfortable for them to and more at ease in sitting down. An open area. Sometimes my wife and I are shopping and we're pushing a cart along, and then she'll say, wait right here. And she'll go start looking at something somewhere else. And she leaves me in the middle of the aisle. Okay. Somebody coming along says, excuse me, sir. And I don't even know which way to turn. Should I go left? Should I go right? How did I get out of their way? You know, and I'm like, go left and there might be somebody else there, or go right and I might run into something else there. So I always tell my wife, if you're going to leave me in the middle of an aisle, you're going to have to move me against something, maybe against the aisle there where the shelves are. In a room, if she's going to leave me in a room, then I say, put me against the wall or stand me by the door. That way I have a sense of direction, a point of reference. And I know I'm out of the way, out of everybody's way, and I'm not just standing in the middle of a room and not knowing which way to turn if I have to turn, and people are trying to get by me. So just plain courtesy and makes each person with a visual impairment more comfortable with themselves and their environment. Some people with visual impairments, they use guide dogs, okay? Not so much on the reservation, but there's still some out there. The guide dog is taking care of the visually impaired individual, okay? That guide dog is working. That guide dog is on the job. So basically, the etiquette is, if a dog is working, don't bother the dog. Don't feed the dog. Don't try to pet the dog. If you're going to do that, ask for permission first from that person that has the guide dog. Otherwise, that guide dog is going to get distracted. And so that guide dog is trained to take care of that person and feed that person. And doesn't, with distractions, you know, it could cause some person to run into a wall or something like that. So be aware of guide dogs in that manner. When they say they fill out their application or you need some other documents to be signed by that individual, get a credit card or get a card of some kind and put it under that paper and line it up on the signature line underneath the paper with that edge on the signature line. Then they can feel that and then sign along that along that edge there with the card underneath. That's the guide to keep their signature on that line. And so when you need documents to be signed by that individual, and then after that, then it's real helpful to date it for them, but get them to sign that paper, use a card underneath the paper on the line, and then have them sign that. Okay. I was saying earlier, I have a JAWS reader program, and that's one of the accommodations that were given to me, by the Law Center when I started working back in 2006. And that reader program, like I said, helps me to function most like others without a visual impairment. I can do a lot of things on my own. I can send emails, I can receive emails, I can send out letters, I can do research, just about anything. But The JAWS reader program does not read scanned documents, okay? If somebody sends a scanned document, it will not open it. It's got to be an original document, original PDF. If it's a scan and then it's PDF, it will not read it. And in some cases, and I don't know if NHA policies and procedures, I want to look at policy procedures of NHA. If some of those documents are scanned as part of the policy manual, my reader program won't read it. And so be aware that scanned documents, visually impaired people who may have access to a computer, may have a reader program, and you say, okay, I'll send you the application. And if the application is scanned in, it's not any good to them. You won't open it, okay? So be aware, if you're communicating with people with visual impairment, if it's a scanned document, then it's not any use to a visually impaired person. You might have to go back and call them and help them fill out the form, because otherwise you'll never get that form back, or they're not able to complete that document. And so the application is very important. So in most cases, probably as they come into the office, helping them with that application. And so getting the application done in some manner, and any other documents that is needed. The other thing too is you go into some websites, it's visually impaired to navigate a website. Very difficult for me. It's got too many directions, too many instructions, too many things on that website, and I really can't navigate them. So I have to get some cases, have somebody help me with the navigation of them. So they might have it. They might have a access to a computer, but ask them, do you know how to navigate a website? Don't just say, go on a website and the application's there. They say, do you know how to use a website, and are you able to navigate? And do you think you'll be able to get and find the application or other information that they need? This is a simple question. Are you able to do that? Because myself, I've been visually impaired now 50 years, and I still can't navigate a computer the way others can. And so my wife helps me, but she's saying, okay, the reason why you couldn't get in because there's another area right here on the right side of where you're at, and that reader program isn't reading that area on the right side of what you're looking at, and it's asking you to push a button. But on my reader program, it might not even show that. It might not even say push button here for opening or whatever. So sometimes that's happened many times. I try to navigate it. Finally, I had to call my wife, and I can't get in. And she says, oh, it's over here on the right side. That's why it's away from where that line that you were reading. So those things occur. So reader programs are great, but they're not as, I guess, efficient as people with non-visual, with visual or not visually impaired to use. They can use it a lot more better than person with visual impairment. When you're leaving, say you're helping somebody and with a visual impairment, and you're sitting across the desk from them. If you get up and go into another room looking for something, that person doesn't know you left that's visually impaired, okay? You have to tell them, I need to get up and go into the other room and get this other document. That way they know where you're at, because like for me, my wife still has a problem with that. We'll be eating and she'll get up and go to the restroom. And that's what I'm doing. I'm thinking she's there and I'm talking to her. Then no answer. And I found out that she left the table. It's embarrassing, you know. People probably at the next table looking at you and wondering what you're doing. So I had to tell my wife, when you're leaving the table, let me know that you're leaving, that you're going to the restroom, whatever you're going to do, just don't get up and go. She's still learning that. But in the case where you're helping somebody, if you're going to leave, let them know. And then when you're back, let them know. Okay? Open doors are very hazardous. Open doors, like halfway open, very hazardous to those of us with visual impairment. Because you don't know that door is halfway open and you walk right into it. I've met many a door in my lifetime. And so even at home, my wife leaves the doors wide open, or she completely closes them because she knows I'm going to run into that door if it's halfway open. Even going to the restroom or going into the bedroom, the living room, wherever. And in the office, the same thing. If there's a door halfway open, I'll run into that door, no doubt. So, you know, I've hit my head hard on some places or ran into it with my shoulder, my chest area, very painful. So be aware of open doors. If there's someone with visual impairment, and make sure that there's no doors halfway open, or they'll, if they need to go to the restroom and there's a door halfway open, they're going to run it right into that door. Okay, that's your visual impairment side of some of the things that just the basics. There's a lot of things to be talked about, but just to give you an idea of some of the things to be aware of when you're a person with a visual impairment comes to the NHA office for assistance. Walking in one of the things is parking lots. If they're sandy and rocky, people with visual impairment, it's hard for them to navigate that because it's rocky and it's people tend to fall. Same with people in wheelchairs or people on walkers. It's just uneven. It's just very uneasy feeling that when parking lots are that way. But just to be aware of what we go through when we come up against those kind of parking lot surfaces. Hearing impairment, just a little bit about that. People with a hearing impairment, they might be with somebody again, okay, helping them, or they might be by themselves. Again, you have a wide range of hearing impairment from not being able to hear some, but not being able to hear much. Okay, it's like your vision. So if they're hearing impairment and the best way to get their attention is tap them on the shoulder or wave at them so they know that you're giving them attention. That and you speak again directly to them, even though they're hearing impaired. And then if there was somebody and that person with a hearing impairment doesn't understand, then that person can help. But they're there to receive services from NHA, and so we should be dealing directly with that individual and speaking directly with them, standing in front of them, and see if and as far as some of them, they can lip read, okay, but most of them can't. So when you talk to them, if they respond, then you have an idea that yes, this person can lip read. But if they don't, then you know that they need help in a different way, okay? Don't yell at a person that's hearing impaired, okay? If you need to communicate with them because they can't hear, write notes to them, then they'll respond. And then when you're talking with them, say, if they're facing you and behind you is the window, they have a hard time reading your lips if they're lip readers. So you have to be the other way around, where the window is behind that person and the light source is shining on you, because they need to see your face, your expression, because they determine a lot by what your expression is, by your body language. They communicate more and understand more about what you're trying to ask, through your expression and body language and your lip, doing lip reading. So the light source should be shining on them, on you, and they should be behind. The light source should probably be behind you. So just a few tips on that one there. People with speech impairments, okay? Again, in all of these, and any person that has a disability, speak to that person. Again, somebody that might have a speech impairment, talk directly to them and face them and give them that courtesy. Sometimes people with speech impairment, when you talk to them, talk slowly to them, and also to people who have hearing impairments. And if you don't understand, don't pretend you understand. Ask them to repeat what they are saying, because there's a lot of disabilities where you're going to find that people have slurred speeches. As a matter of fact, like traumatic brain injuries, they have slurred speech, and sometimes it sounds like they're intoxicated, but they are not. That's just the nature of their disability, okay? So if you don't understand, tell them to repeat. They'll repeat it to you, until you both understand, you're on the same page of what you're talking about and what is needed. But do it in an encouraging and positive manner. Don't get upset with them because they're trying to communicate, they're trying to get some services, and they just want to be understood. They just want people to take time out for understanding what they need. So give them that courtesy. And be patient with them as much as you can. That's the only way you're going to get services with people with speech impairments. When you're going to need something, ask them a question that's short, that requires a short answer. Don't give a whole big long question. That way they can answer even just not yes or not no, or they can give you a short answer to your short question. And just kind of chop it up if you need to. That way they can take time to respond and won't they have to give a long answer. So alrighty, that's your visual impairment, there's your speech disability, your hearing disability. So now I'm going to go into the last section, which is hidden disabilities. Okay. Hidden disabilities are those disabilities that you can't see, they're not visual, okay? A lot of your mental health issues are that way. And some of those are learning disabilities. There's a number of different kinds of learning disabilities. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of our veterans have those. Our law enforcement have those. And we'll go over some of the characteristics of those after we go to give an idea of some of the hidden disabilities. TBI, ADHD, attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorders, when they have person has a lot of mood swings, people who are schizophrenic, intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is the new term. It's the political corrective way to say that somebody has mental retardation. The word mental retardation is not accepted in the disability arena anymore. So it's an intellectual disability is what they call it now. So try to remember that and get away from the word mental retardation. Handicap is another word, okay? That's obsolete. It's people with disabilities or individuals with a disability or persons with a disability, not handicap. And special needs is another word that they use. So the word handicap is no longer politically correct. And it's been taken out of a lot of documents, a lot of different places where signs were taken down. I know people say, oh, that's handicap parking, but it's parking for people with parking with people with disabilities. Okay, so handicap is out. Try to refrain from using that term. And then there are all a bunch of personality disorders, and then major depression disorders, and there's a whole bunch of mental illness that are hidden. Okay, you don't know when you see the person, you don't know that's what that's what they've been diagnosed with, or that's their disability. So just be aware, but eventually they'll manifest themselves as you start to talk and more with them. The general characteristics of that's probably across all mental health disorders is much difficulty in reading and writing. Okay, a lot of them who have a cognitive disability have very much difficulty in reading and writing. They have much difficulty in following instructions also. They have difficulty with oral and written instructions, like I said, oral also as well as written. Some of them have short attention spans. Okay, they'll get somewhat, I guess you say, antsy because they have short attention span. And notice that the application is like 23 pages long, and somebody with a cognitive disability or a mental health disability, they're probably not going to be able to sit down and finish that application in one setting because that's the nature of their disability. Okay, and so if they start to get antsy and start to lose attention with what you're doing, you can ask them, is this too much for you? Or should we schedule another time and finish it? Or do you just need to walk around for a little while? Give them that, because it's probably part of your disability. Comprehension, most of the disabilities have, where people cannot very well comprehend things that are very abstract, or things that are complex, or analytical thinking. So just be aware that you have to make sure that the person understands what you're doing, what's being asked, and what's being needed, that they comprehend that. So go back here. I'm working off my tape recorder here. Memory is another one. Okay. If you ask them, when did you become, when did your disability come onset? They might not even remember. If you went over some papers and things with them in the office, you told them to come back, next step will be doing this, and you could go back, they might not even remember what was done at that first meeting. So you have to remember them, help them. Last time you came in, this is what we did. This is what we talked about. Now we're going to do this. So memory is a situation for them, which again is the nature of their disability. Some of them may become hyperactive, like I was saying. You're filling out something, you're talking with them, you're interviewing with them. They become hyperactive. They start to move around and not paying attention. A lot of these disabilities, people with these cognitive and mental health disabilities, they don't trust. They're non-trusting, or a level of trust level is somewhat going to exist, especially if you ask a lot of questions, then they start to get even more non-trusting. So you have to work around that somehow, and maybe have somebody help them, or it's just the nature, again, of the disability. It's just the lack of trust for people. And a lot of them have communication problems. Okay, when you ask them a question, you might have to repeat the question. They respond to you, make sure you know what they're talking about. They rephrase what you think they're saying. So communication is a big issue for them. And a lot of them cannot navigate a computer. Probably a lot of them never use a computer. A lot of them probably don't have access to it. Those of us that work with computers on a daily basis, we know more about computers than somebody with a disability who might just be at home and not working, not going to school, or just the disability level is such that they're just at home with their families. So computers is something that they don't understand. They're not educated. They don't have the skills for that. And then, of course, a lot of them have their speech difficulties again. Slurred speeches, talk real slow, talk real low. And so just understand that you're going to have, some of them are going to have speech difficulties. And so they become impatient at times too, like I was saying, become hyperactive, become impatient, and have short attention spans. Some of them will have mood swings. They'll come in okay, you go through a process, and their moods might swing somewhere within that process. So just be aware of that. That happens, don't get all excited. Just try to control the situation and get some help, somebody they might be with, or maybe just try to calm them down. So those are some of the things that just to be aware of, and some of the things that just to think about. If I saw a person like that, what would I do? If I ran against that situation that's been described, what would be my response? And how can I just work around it and be able to help those with disabilities to access housing? And that's the main thing, is accessibility to housing. Okay. So we went through visual impairment, speech difficulties, hearing impairment, and then hidden disabilities. And we didn't go in, there's a lot of different disabilities, but just be aware that all people who looks like there's nothing wrong with them, they might have a hidden disability, and it will eventually manifest itself. Or ask them, do you need assistance? What do you need help with? And most cases, they'll let you know. Okay. So I think that's all I'm gonna give today, and turn the time over to Cecilia.
Ya te hebene. Sheya Cecilia and Shiedo. I have a disability. So what I'm gonna talk about is a little bit about myself. I have a spinal cord injury. I got injured at the age of between 8 and 9. And I have a T6 injury on my spinal. So I'm in a chair. I grew up this way. It is very hard to get around when you are in a wheelchair. At the beginning, when I got back from the hospital, my dad had to redo our front door of the house, the doors into the bedrooms. So it was very difficult for me because I couldn't get into the house by myself. So when you're disabled and when you're in a wheelchair, is the most hardest thing to live because you can't walk. So going into the front door, when I came home, when it started raining, when it started having snowstorms, you know, my brothers or either my dad, they used to carry me into the house because my chair would sink into the mud or either into the snow where I can't even move. But that was the hardest thing for me because, you know, I always told my brothers and my sisters, I said, you guys are lucky that you can use your legs and walk and just get off the vehicle and just walk into the house. For me, it was hard. So talking about my injury I have, it's like moving around in your house, yeah. And as you're getting off, and it's not just, I've been to some of the office where on the Navajo reservation, and they don't have sidewalks, some of them. They don't have driveways. So this is the most difficult thing for me because I always have to see where I can get off if it's slanted, and you might roll backwards and where you're trying to get into your chair from the vehicle. So there's a lot of things that you can see that can happen to you when you're alone by yourself. I used to drive alone by myself a lot. Today, I am 65 years old and I have to have an attendant to go with me, or I have to have Jim to come with me. certain places where I really need to go. I don't go by myself anymore because I cannot make it alone by myself anymore. So and these places that like, let's say I have some of my friends that live in an NHA housing, and I notice driving up to the driveway or either to the houses. There's one place I went to, one of the office I went to didn't have a driveway, but they had sidewalks, NHA. And I was like, how does a person with a wheelchair get off into the muddy area? There's no gravel there, it's just plain mud, plain, dirt. Sand and dirt is not good for my chair because it can sink into the dirt. And it's going to be difficult to push my chair. And it's even difficult, even when you have an attendant, even pushing your chair, because your chair tends to get stuck into the dirt or the mud, snow in the out. So you have to look at these things. When you're in a wheelchair, you have to make sure where you're getting off, where you can get, you have to look around to see where it's accessible for you. Going into the front door, let's say that I'm going into the house. When you go into the house, you see a glass door, a screen door, and you have to have somebody open that door for you in order to get into the house. The doorknob. And if you have like arthritis, you cannot turn that doorknob on your own, or if you're quadriplegic, that's a person that's paralyzed from the neck down, and that person cannot open the door by themselves. You have to have an L-shaped doorknob in order to open the door. Making it through the door. Make sure there's not, your chair. You have to have somebody helping you give you a boost to get in. But if I was by myself, getting into that kind of doorway, it's going to be hard for me, because as older as I am now, I have to have assistant just even getting into the door. So doorway, you have to have a flat surface going into the door. And that's kind of difficult if you have even a little bump, maybe at an inch or 2 inches. It's kind of like you have to have an assistant. Coming into the house, let's say I came in at night and the light switch is way up there and I can't reach that light switch. If I was like a quad, or even me with my arm the way I am now, I cannot reach that light switch and turn the light on. So there's light switches that have to be lower so I can reach the light switch to turn on the lights coming into the house. So you have to visualize when you're coming through the house and when you have to turn the light switch on. And then in the doorway, like the house I'm living in that I purchased, that I have through my doors, my door is 36 inches wide. My door is 35 and a quarter. So it's accessible for me when I'm pushing myself. I don't get scrapes. I don't get squishing between my door using my handle on my chair. That's the hard part. And sometimes when I go to visit a friend or so, I can't make it into their house because the doors are not wide enough, or either into their bathroom, so I can't really visit anyone. And then there's people that have stairs and I can't get into their house either. So that makes it really hard for me. But living in a house and one of my friends' house, I barely got into her house and I barely made it around in her house because I'm like, the way they make the houses are already not accessible. So talking about the light switches, all the rooms should have lower light switches. The kitchen, where you can get around, and living by yourself is going to be hard, but at my age, I have to have an attendant. Adonana, bathroom doors and bedroom doors should all have like L-shaped door handles because like I said, if you have like arthritis, if you're quadriplegic, you can't turn the doorknob into the bedrooms and to the bathroom. Bathroom, Nana, there's the showers should be a walk-in shower, not a bathtub, because even older people, yeah, they can't get into the tub. It's very hard. They can fall also. So the showers, they should have like grab bars all the way around. Plus around the toilet, there should be grab bars for them to for them to get around also. And it's not just talking for myself, it's talking for people that are elderly people also. It's very easy because we have to have shower chairs. Shower chair can go into the shower where you can take a shower, bathtub, because we have to slide onto the shower chair. And you can, even for an elderly person, they have to use a shower chair. Grab bars again, genre, because you can grab the bars and hold yourself up, or you can hold that grab bar so you're not able to fall. And it's very schedule. I usually use and move around using my handlebars to move into the shower. Or I could pick up my shampoo while I'm using the shower handle. Aided, it's very helpful to have those grab bars. So it's very easy for moving around in there. The toilet is the same way. You have to have the grab bar so you can put, move around in there, and it's easy for me because I can use that to move around and get back on my chair. Nana, and the doorways, the bathroom shouldn't be so small either, where your chair just goes one way in and then back way out. The sink again in the bathroom should have where the sink is sitting, you should have a lower sink, and also you can drive your chair underneath the sink where you can reach the faucet. And if I don't have that, there's no way I can turn the faucet on, or I'd be sitting sideways, and that's the main, it's going to be hard that way. So you have to have a place where you can drive yourself underneath the sink, and you can brush your teeth, you can wash your face, you can be an accessible sink in the bathroom. Adonana, the kitchen is the same way. When you come into the kitchen, you can, the sink should be lower, the counters should be down, where you can move around, where you can get yourself water, maybe do some dishes yourself if you can. So this is the hardest thing when you go into a housing, when their sinks are high, the counters are high, you can't do anything. So when I had my house built, I guess the people that made the house, they didn't think about that part in my kitchen. Right now, I'm trying to get somebody to do my countertop where it's low for me, where I can get into push myself into the sink level where I can do my own, at least get my water, at least do some of the dishes myself, just at least rinse them. It's really hard because the counter is so high, and I'm like I can barely turn the water on. But this is the hard part. So if I get that sink lowered, I can do stuff in the kitchen. But now this is the hard part too, is that your room has to be, I don't know, this is the way I designed my house, was my bedroom is small. The second time when I had my house built, I asked for a larger bedroom because of my wheelchair. If a person is in a wheelchair, the bedroom should be a little wider because the chair has to go in between the bed, and they should have room where you can have an accessibility to move around into your bedroom. And getting in and out of bed, that's the most important thing too, because when I visit one of my friends, they barely could move around in their bedroom, and she says, I don't have enough room in this room because I can't even reach my dresser, and I can't move around. It's like I go in and go out. Closet door, the closet doors are narrow. You cannot get in there yourself and pick out what you need in the closet. And that's another thing that's she had a hard time with also. So, I mean, moving around and you're living in that house and you want accessibility, you need to get around and pick up what you need, move around in your house, and your wheelchair is the most important thing that you move around with, and that's your legs. So these are things that I have a hard time with, and even getting around in the house, you have to have accessibility in the house. Bathtub is not, bathtub is no good for a person that's disabled. The shower, the walk-in showers are so accessible to use, and even grandpas are, it's easier for them to step in and out of the shower. Railings, the back door in your house. The back door should be accessible in case of a fire, in case something happens, because if you go out the back door and if it has a step, you're going to have a hard time and you can't make it out by yourself. Another thing is the back door should have like a flat surface where there's concrete, where you can move your chair and get out of there. And hopefully there's people that help you move around in the back, or your attendant or whoever they're living with. So if there's a ramp that has to be built, there's should be a ramp if there's a step, because getting out of the back door is another thing for an emergency exit. So a lot of times I see houses that they have back doors, but I don't know if it's accessible or not. I really don't know how the NHA housing are, but just to see one of my friends living in that house, she has a hard time getting around in her house. And another thing is paying their bill. She says she has a hard time paying her bill because she has to go into the nearest place to pay a bill. And I said, is there like a call-in where you can call in and pay your bill? I said, I call and pay my utilities and pay my house through my Visa card. I said, is there a way that you can do that instead of having your attendant driving you in and paying your bill with the schneck? And she said, no. She said that sometimes nobody answers the phone. I don't get no response, so we have to drive in. And then another thing is like my window was broken and I kept complaining about it and I never got my window fixed. So I had to have somebody come in, take my window out and get it repaired, Mila. So these are things that if you're disabled, it's the hardest thing. You can't go and do things yourself. So you always have to have somebody and get a hold of someone to do things for you. So this is hard, even though, yeah, you have a phone and you call people, you talk to people to come over and help you. So you can't move and walk out the door, get in the vehicle and go there on your own and get things done, or you can do things yourself. It is the hardest thing when you're in a wheelchair or when you're a quadriplegic. Quadriplegics are, I think, it is the most hardest thing to be because I can use my hands and I can do some stuff. But as I am getting older, it's very hard for me because I have like carpal tunnel in my hands, my wrists, and it's getting a little harder for me. So there's more assistance that you have to have when you're a quad because a quadriplegic is a person that cannot dress themselves, they can't feed themselves, they can't reach and pick up things themselves. That's a quadriplegic. They can't, everything has to be done for them. And it is the most hardest thing to live that way. So even getting in the vehicle is hard for them. Getting out of the vehicle is hard for them. They can't even push themselves. So and they can't hold a pencil. They can't write their own name. They can probably read, but they can, try to sign their name, but their name is not written on there. So that's another thing. And some people can use their mouth to hold a pen and sign. And there's, paper beyond name. You're gonna have to say, how is it easy for you to sign? Or, just put your thumb on there, or, uh, they're like that. They can't use their hands, their fingers, nada. And this is the hardest thing for a quadriplegic. So you have to understand and accessibility, then I know that there's a lot of things that I hate to say this, but the Navajo tribe does not see or help some people with accessibility. The ADA laws, they don't see that. But on it, that things happen and you end up that way, and it's going to be hard. So I always talk about the way I live, and you know, just going through these things on the housing, and how you come into the office. I hope the offices are all paved. Hopefully, I don't know, through the Navajo Nation NHA Housing Office, I don't know, but there's one office that don't have a driveway. That's the one that I went to. So driveway is a lot easier because you can get onto your chair. You don't have to mess around with dragging your chair through the mud or through the gravel and the dirt. So it's much easier for us to move around. Although you can do it on your own if you're able to get in and out of the car yourself. But always give a few minutes for that person to come in. Let's say you made a 9 o'clock appointment and that person is on their own and trying to get into the office. So it might take maybe 10 minutes for them to take their chair out of the vehicle and get into the chair. So when I worked, it was like that. They gave me I show up like 15 minutes early so I can get in out of my vehicle into the wheelchair and then get into the office. So, just give them time. Another thing is, if they call you and they say they're outside and wanting some assistance, maybe you can assist them a little bit just to get them in the doorway. But the doors, the office doors should be accessible also, so they can go into the office and fill out their application, or either, some office you come in and they're crowded. Um, there, there's a way around that you can move around to get to their desk, or make it comfortable where they can come in and sit at the desk where they can fill out their forms, or where you can meet. Maybe your office might be in the back, and you can go to the front and help them. And some offices are like that. You have to go through these doors. So you can help them any way you can. Some of their chairs are narrow, some of their chairs are wider, and some like quads, or they have wheelchairs that are, battery operated chairs. And that's the hard part, is getting into the door with the chair like that. Those chairs are powerful. You can, we can crash through the door. Because when I use my electric wheelchair, I kind of put a dent in my stove because I didn't know my power is still on, and I kind of like pushed it a little bit with my arm, and I went and crashed into my stove. So you have to be very careful when they're in an electric wheelchair, because going through the door, you can kind of like rip that door. And so make sure your doors are wide enough. The ADA is like standard 36, 35, the doorways. So that's how your office doors should be accessible. Accessible office. Make your office accessible where people can come and have their way around. That's what but I grew up in my wheelchair. I always make sure where I'm going, where I can get around. And a lot of these places are not accessible. And I have a hard time getting in and out of the places where I need to go, or I would just send my attendant in to do some carrying some papers for me. But the quads are like that. Oh my gosh. When I'm always thinking about one of my friends that's a quadriplegic. Oh, they have the hardest time. So I think it's like when you're living alone, it's very hard for them, and they have to depend on an attendant. And please make the houses you have, make them accessible for a person to live in and to feel like them, that's their home, to get around, to do things, and not give them a hard time, but make it easier for them also, so they can pay their bill and make sure that they're well taken care of with like their light fixtures, their heaters, uh, things that are broken in their house. I'll show to let them, when they report something, I'll show to fix that up for them, because it's the most difficult thing when the houses are not updated, and things that need to be replaced. Because I know that the person I know is living that way and has to keep reporting and reporting. And it's the most hard thing to do, because aside, and they're disabled. And that's all I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me set up this PowerPoint real quick. Okay, hope everybody is able to see this. So thank you, Ms. Fred, and thank you, Hosky. Again, as Hosky said earlier, my name is Austin Moore. I'm an attorney with the Native American Disability Law Center here in the Flagstaff office. Thanks again for allowing me to speak with you all today. So I'm going to be covering super exciting topics, statutes and regulations. So first, I'm going to begin with Navajo law, and specifically the Civil Rights of Individuals with Disabilities Act of 2018. And then I'm going to transition into one of the main federal laws that protects individuals with disabilities, Section 504. So the Civil Rights of Individuals with Disabilities Act was passed in 2018 and made numerous findings, and also provided background on the importance of this law. So in the act, the Navajo Nation Council found that, according to an analysis of the 2000 US Census data by the Navajo Nation Division of Economic Development, it was found that 70.4% of all Navajos aged 65 and over are individuals with disabilities. And the population of Navajos aged 16 to 64, 27.5% are individuals with disabilities. And in the population of Navajos aged 5 to 15, 4.6 are individuals with disabilities. And this was from the 2000 US Census, and the numbers have always been increasing since then, and are likely higher in 2020. So on April 25th, 1979, the Navajo Nation Council approved the Navajo Affirmative Action Plan to ensure that Navajo individuals with disabilities have equal access to employment opportunities and to public buildings on the Navajo Nation, and adopted a plan of operation for the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities, which Hosky is actually the president of. The Affirmative Action Plan was grounded on the premise that all persons should have an opportunity to realize their greatest potential to the extent of their mental and/or physical capabilities, and directed affirmative steps to be taken by numerous Navajo Nation programs to ensure non-discrimination in hiring and employment and access for the individuals with disabilities to all public buildings, private businesses, and public activities and services. Later, in the Navajo Sovereignty and Education Act of 2005, the Navajo Nation Council included a section entitled Vocational Rehabilitation and Opportunities for Individuals with Disabilities, which directed all public and private entities to cooperate with the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities, and recognizing that people with disabilities as potentially productive members of society, and in making reasonable accommodations to the special needs of persons with disabilities, including the need for site accessibility in regard to employment, housing, public accommodations, social services, transportation, recreation, educational and training opportunities, and community services, and assure the availability of these services on an equitable, non-discriminatory basis. So in addition to the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities, there are references in the statutes to both the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on the Handy-Capable and the Navajo Nation Council on Handicap. The Navajo Nation Council found that all such designations are intended to refer to the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities. Fast forwarding to 2014, on November 17th, 2014, Navajo Nation President Ben Shelley issued Executive Order number 14/2014 called Ensuring the Rights of Navajos with Disabilities to Full Access to All Navajo Nation Buildings and Services. And while this executive order mandated that all Navajo Nation divisions, departments, enterprises, or entities shall develop, update, or amend current policies and procedures to ensure that services are provided in an equitable and non-discriminatory manner, such agency action is far from complete, leaving individuals with disabilities vulnerable to policies and procedures that may lead to inaccessibility, discrimination, or both. The Navajo Nation Council also found that despite the clearly stated policy and intent of the Navajo Nation to ensure individuals with disabilities have full access to employment, housing, and public services, that goal had never been realized, and individuals with disabilities remain at a severe disadvantage in having full access to equal opportunity in all of those areas. The Navajo Nation Council found that the most likely reasons for that failure have been the lack of funding for and any clear authority of the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities, the absence of mandatory directives to programs on the Navajo Nation, whether those programs be public or private, and the absence of provisions within Navajo law for the enforcement of the rights of individuals with disabilities. So finally, the Navajo Nation Council found that the most effective means of ensuring that individuals with disabilities are provided equal access to employment, housing, education, services, and buildings, whether they be governmental or private in nature, is to incorporate those rights into the Navajo Nation Code and to replace the existing code with more substantive civil rights in order to make the law both specific and enforceable. And this is what became the Civil Rights Act of 2018. So between both Navajo and federal laws, there's a lot of terms that share similar definitions. So I apologize in advance if it seems like I begin to repeat myself a lot today, but hopefully this helps folks remember the common definitions and highlight what the key points are. So the Civil Rights Act contains four main definitions that work and relate to one another in the law. So first, the Civil Rights Act defines disability as physical or mental impairment that substantially limits an individual's ability to engage in one or more major life activity. So you might ask, what is a major life activity? So major life activities are those that include, for example, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, those sort of things that you do day-to-day life. Additional major life activities might include the operation of a major bodily function, such as functions of the immune system, cell growth, digestive, bowel, those sort of things. So these are both related to physical and mental disabilities and physical and mental life activities. The third definition is reasonable accommodation. So the Act defines this as a necessary and appropriate modification, not imposing a disproportionate or undue hardship, needed to ensure that a person with a disability is able to obtain, access, or participate in a particular right, benefit, or opportunity. And the last definition is undue hardship. So this is an action requiring significant difficulty or an expense on the program when considering the following factors. So the nature and cost of the accommodation needed, 2, the overall finances, financial resource of the facility included in the provision of the reasonable accommodation. 3rd, the overall financial resources of the covered entity, the size of the business, the number, type, and location of its facilities. And then 4th, the type of operation of the covered entity. So the composition, structure, and functions of the workforce. So in other words, you can sort of think of this as a balancing test between the cost of the accommodation and the ability of the program to provide the accommodation. So while the Act applies to all those various areas I explained before, employment, public services, and housing, particular to the housing context, the Act states that any provider of public housing on the Navajo Nation must make reasonable accommodations in its policies, practices, premises, and provision of services, as well as afford a tenant or prospective tenant with a disability the opportunity to occupy, use, and enjoy a dwelling and its premises to the same extent as any other tenant. The Act also states that no provider of private or public housing on the Navajo Nation shall discriminate against individuals with disabilities in the provision of housing. And this doesn't only apply to just the residences and houses themselves. This is also going to apply to offices and services. So that Act states that no otherwise qualified person with a disability shall by reason of such disability be denied or excluded from the benefit of any service, program, or activity offered by any governmental or public entity on the Navajo Nation, unless no reasonable accommodations can be made which will afford access to and participation in such program or activity. I have remedies listed here, but I'm going to talk about that here. So after hearing those definitions, how do we apply those definitions? What evidence must be shown and what remedies can be provided? So you can sort of think of this process sort of like a pendulum. So to begin, the Navajo Civil Rights Act requires that medical evidence is necessary to establish that an individual has a disability. So sources of medical evidence may include documentation from medical facilities, or they can come from traditional sources such as the testimony of medicine men. An individual seeking the protection of civil rights stated in the Civil Rights Act, as an individual with a disability, will have to demonstrate that he or she has a disability as defined earlier. So then once it's been established that an individual has a disability, then the pendulum swings towards the other way. The Act requires that the denial of a request for reasonable accommodations can only be made by demonstrating undue hardship. So as an example, say a person provides the NHA with a doctor's letter stating that he or she has a visual disability and requires that communication be provided in an accessible format, thus establishing a disability. Then the NHA would consider the resources available to provide this accommodation. So this is always by case, but generally providing documents in Braille, large print, or other alternative formats, such as the things Hosky was talking about earlier, are generally seen not as undue hardships. But if the request is something like the individual needs a helicopter to fly them to an NHA office because they need a ride, that might be an undue hardship. That's a little bit of a silly example, but it kind of shows the balancing act and the case-by-case sort of analysis that goes into these determinations. As for remedies, any person injured in violation of the Civil Rights Act and their fundamental rights as the result of an action or a failure to act may seek remedies for such a violation in the form of legal and equitable relief in the courts of the Navajo Nation. So the Civil Rights Act might be a little short compared to a lot of the other laws, but it does contain a lot of important protections for individuals with disabilities on the Navajo Nation. So next we're going to transition to the federal law that applies to NHA, which is Section 504. I'm sure you have all learned a lot of this from this class, so bear with me as I run through Section 504. So Section 504 is a part of a larger act, which is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in federally assisted programs or activities. So this can apply to housing, but like the Civil Rights Act on the Navajo Nation, it also applies to employment, education, and a lot of other programs and activities. So specifically, Section 504 states that no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall, solely by reason of her or his disability, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program, service, or activity receiving federal financial assistance, or under any program or activity conducted by any executive agency. So basically what this means is Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in any program that receives financial assistance from any federal agency. So because the NHA receives funds from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, through the Indian Housing Block Grant under NAHASDA, which is the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. This is how Section 504 applies to NHA. Additionally, there are HUD regulations for 504 that also apply, which we'll go over some of those in a little bit, but for the most part, I'm going to focus on just the Section 504 statute itself. So let's go back to that definition I read earlier. No otherwise qualified individual with a disability. What does that mean? So here's where it's going to sound like I'm repeating myself because a lot of the language is similar to the Navajo Nation Civil Rights Act. So an individual with a disability in the Section 504 is any person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So the term physical or mental impairment may include conditions such as a visual or hearing impairment, mobility impairment, but can also include things like HIV infection, developmental disabilities, drug addiction, or mental illness. And remember, these determinations are very case by case. So remember that none of these are hard, fast rules. For the second part, the term major life activity may include seeing, hearing, walking, breathing, those sort of day-to-day activities. And then remember, again, this list is not exhaustive. So Section 504 also protects persons who have a record of such impairment or are regarded as having such an impairment. So for example, say an individual undergoes treatment for cancer and then returns to work. Although the person may have recovered and the cancer is in remission, they would still have a record of having had it. And Section 504 would apply to them as well. So what practices are prohibited? Again, Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in any program or activity receiving federal assistance. So this means, for example, that persons with disabilities may not be denied the opportunity to participate in a program because of their disability, may not be required to accept a different kind or lesser program or service than what is provided to others without disabilities, and may not be required to participate in separate programs from those available to persons without disabilities, even if those separate programs and services exist. With respect to housing in general, a housing provider may not deny or refuse to sell or rent to a person with a disability, and may not impose application or qualification criteria, rental fees or sales prices, and rental or sales terms and conditions that are different than those required of or provided to persons without disabilities. Housing providers may not require persons with disabilities to live only on certain floors or only in one section of a housing project. Housing providers may not refuse to make repairs, may not limit or deny someone with a disability access to recreational and other public and common use facilities, parking privileges, cleaning or janitorial services, or any services which are made available to residents without disabilities. Additionally, persons with disabilities may not be denied the opportunity to serve on planning or advisory boards because of their disabilities. So a common question that exists out there is, so does Section 504 require a housing provider to accept every person with a disability who applies for housing? And the short answer is no. Section 504 does not require that a person with a disability always be accepted without regard to the eligibility requirements or his or her ability to meet standard non-discriminatory tenant selection and screening criteria. So rather, Section 504 requires that a person with a disability be evaluated using the same objective criteria that are applied to persons without disabilities, provided such criteria is non-discriminatory and subject to reasonable accommodations and the provision of appropriate aids and services necessary to ensure effective communication. So applicants, both with or without a disability, may be rejected if they have a record of adversely affecting others, excessively disturbing neighbors, destroying property, failing to pay their rent on time, any of those things that would apply to both people with or without disabilities. So in this, housing providers must make sound and reasonable judgments based on objective and reliable evidence, so current conduct or history of overt acts. This means that subjective fears, rumors, speculation, generalized suspicion does not constitute objective information that an applicant cannot meet the terms of tenancy. So housing providers are also subject to reasonable accommodation requirements with respect to such policies and may be required to make exceptions based on manifestations of some disabilities. And we're going to talk about some of those things in a second. So another issue that comes up is whether or not housing providers can require tenants to pay for these additional services and requirements. For example, may a housing provider charge a person who uses a wheelchair a higher security deposit because of concerns about damage to the dwelling unit? And again, the answer here is no. An individual with a disability who uses a wheelchair is no more likely than anyone else to cause damage beyond typical wear and tear to a dwelling unit. However, if a person who uses a wheelchair does cause damage to a unit that's beyond the normal wear and tear that may be caused by use of a wheelchair, that individual may be required to cover the costs of that damage out of a standard security deposit that's charged to everybody. Remember, there can't be a separate higher security deposit. So what it all basically comes down to is that you must treat all renters in the same manner. Another example might be service animals. A landlord may be obligated to modify a no pets rule to allow a person to have a service animal in their home. But then again, if the animal, chews through the door, scratches up the wall, stains the carpets, those are going to be things beyond normal wear and tear. And then in those instances, the person may need to pay for damages. Next, we're going to be talking about program accessibility. So what does this mean? So program accessibility means that a program or activity, when viewed in its entirety, is readily accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities. So this also recognizes that there may be some limits to the degree to which existing housing programs can be made accessible. So under this concept of program accessibility, in an existing housing program, not every single building must be accessible or every single dwelling unit, but there must be sufficient accessibility so that persons with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate in and benefit from the program. And individuals with disabilities must also have the same range of choices and amenities as those offered to others without disabilities. So programs must take steps to ensure that their programs and services are readily accessible to individuals with disabilities to the maximum extent feasible, which means the program would be required to take all the steps that provide the necessary access, but which would not constitute an undue financial and administrative burden or requires a fundamental alteration in the nature of the program. And then remember, meeting program accessibility does not exempt programs from meeting the other requirements of Section 504, including the non-discrimination provisions. And there's also requirements that designated accessible dwelling units are dispersed throughout the housing project. So this simply just means an extreme example might be if NHA were to build a bunch of accessible units and say just in the Window Rock area and then call it good. Programs need to provide new construction or need to provide construction of accessible homes throughout the project. So throughout the Navajo Nation for NHA. So a common question in this context of program accessibility is when a mobility accessible unit becomes available, should it be offered to the first applicant on the waiting list or the first person with a disability who requires the accessible features? And the answer would go to the first person with disabilities who requires the accessible features. And you can find this in both the HUD regulations and also the NHA rental policy. So Section 504 additionally requires the program to adopt suitable means to assure that information on available accessible units reaches otherwise qualified individuals with disabilities who need the features of those units. The regulations also require that reasonable non-discriminatory steps to maximize the utilization of accessible units. So what this policy is, just to briefly touch over it, if an accessible unit becomes available in the same project or comparable projects, the unit would go to the first qualified individual with disabilities requiring the home. So for example, if a unit becomes available in Chinle and there's an individual with a disability living in a non-accessible accessible unit in Chinle, the home would then go to that individual. Next, if there's no such persons residing in the project, then it would go to the next available qualified individual on the waiting list in the entire project. So if there's nobody in Chinle, but there's somebody in Shiprock, it would go to them. And then if no qualified applicant with disabilities requires the home, then this is where it would go to an individual or family without disabilities. But the program may include language in the lease requiring the family to agree to move to a non-accessible unit as soon as one becomes available in order to make room for an individual requiring an accessible unit. And this makes sense if you think about it. The purpose in building accessible homes is to provide individuals with disabilities equal opportunity to the program. So if there's accessible units in the project, but individuals with disabilities aren't able to access them, it kind of defeats the whole purpose for the homes. So next we're going to be talking about effective communication. So what steps must programs take to ensure that information about their programs and services are accessible? So HUD's Section 504 regulations requires programs to take appropriate steps to ensure effective communication with applicants, beneficiaries, and members of the public. This may include conducting outreach in a manner that will reach persons with disabilities, such as by working with organizations that serve or represent persons with disabilities, and ensuring that information about their programs is disseminated in a manner that is accessible to persons with disabilities. So like Hosky was saying earlier, for example, furnishing appropriate aids and services, such as the use of interpreters, materials, transcription or captioning services, large print, or other alternate format materials may be necessary. Because those aids and services can greatly increase the effectiveness of outreach and ongoing communication and provide persons with disabilities an equal opportunity to participate in and enjoy the benefits of the program. So a follow-up question to that is, may a program require applicants or tenants to bear the cost of providing these additional aids and services? Again, this is no. Under the regulations, the program must furnish appropriate aids and services where necessary to afford persons with disabilities an equal opportunity to participate in the program. However, a program is not required to provide individually prescribed devices or readers for personal use or study, or other devices of personal nature. They would need to be to assist them in accessing the program. And programs are also not required to take any action that would result in a fundamental alteration in the nature of the program or activity, or an undue administrative and financial burden. Next, we're going to be talking about physical accessibility. So with respect to Section 504's requirements, what is an accessible unit? So we have been talking about accessibility in more of a broad program level sense, but now we're going to switch to on the individual unit level. So Section 504 defines an accessible dwelling unit as a unit that is located on an accessible route and can be approached, entered, and used by individuals with physical disabilities. A unit that is on accessible route and is adaptable and otherwise in compliance with the standards set forth in the regulations is accessible. So in addition, the regulations impose specific accessibility requirements for new construction and alteration of housing and non-housing facilities in HUD-assisted programs. So the technical criteria for these homes can be found in the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, or UFAS. And this is that technical language that Cecilia was discussing earlier about the specific heights and doorway widths, those sort of things. But remember that most units are covered by multiple federal accessibility laws and multiple federally accessible standards. You can find these standards online, or I'm sure Ms. Claw might have a copy of them, or if you reach out to me, I can provide them. But this is going to be, the language of parking spaces need to be 96 inches wide. So we don't have to go into all those here. So what physical accessibility requirements must a new housing development meet in order to be in compliance with Section 504? So this is a little bit more broad. So for a new construction housing project, Section 504 requires that 5% of the dwelling units, or at least one unit, whichever is greater, to be accessible for persons with mobility disabilities. And then an additional 2% of the dwelling units, or at least one unit, whichever is greater, must be accessible for persons with hearing or visual disabilities. And then the specifics for these accessible dwelling units are described in the UFAS standards. So what is meant by new construction? So a new construction project is one that has 4 or more dwelling units and is built for first occupancy after March 13th, 1991. Then it's going to be subject to those 5% and 2% rules. And then the second is, what is a substantial alteration to a housing project? So under Section 504, alterations are substantial if they are undertaken to a project that has 15 or more units, and the cost of alterations is 75% or more of the replacement cost of the completed facility. So if these alterations are going on sorry, I apologize. If these alterations are going to housing projects built before 1991, then they would still need to meet the minimum of 5% of mobility accessible and 2% of accessible units for those with hearing or visual disabilities. So then the last question is, so for programs that are not new constructions or not substantial alterations, what does Section 504 require in those? So if the project involves fewer than 15 units, or the cost of alterations is less than 75% of the replacement costs of the completed facilities, and the program has not already made 5% of the units in the development accessible, a different section applies under 504. So under this requirement, alterations to the dwelling units shall, to the maximum extent feasible, be readily accessible to individuals with disabilities. So if alterations to single elements or spaces of a dwelling unit, when considered together, amount to an alteration of a dwelling unit, then the entire unit shall be made accessible. So what is meant by alteration of the dwelling unit, of the entire unit, would be if the following elements are met. So if the kitchen is being renovated, or at least replacement of kitchen cabinets, renovation of the bathroom, if at least the bathtub or shower is replaced or added, or a toilet or flooring is replaced, and then replacement of entrance door jambs. So if all of those elements are being altered, then the entire unit would be required to be made accessible. But if only one of those things, so if just the kitchen's being renovated, if just the bathroom is being renovated, those things would be needed to be made accessible if 5% of the homes in the whole project are not accessible. So this gets a little confusing. Sorry if that wasn't clear. But the general recommendation to avoid a lot of this is to make 5% of the units accessible. Because if you see the problem here, if you're only making the kitchen of a home accessible, or you're only making the bathroom accessible, or only the entrance door accessible, you're going to end up with homes that have part of the home accessible, but not the entire home. So this is going to be little or no value for persons with mobility impairments. So that's why it's important for these 5% rules and for the units in their entirety be made accessible. Last topic on this, when a program plans alterations, are there areas of the building which are not required to be made accessible under 504? There are some, so this is going to be like mechanical rooms or other spaces that, because of their intended use, will not require accessibility to the public or result in the employment or residence of individuals with physical disabilities. These would not be required to be made accessible, but these are very limited. So most buildings are going to be required to be made accessible. This is just a limited few. Okay, last topic is going to be reasonable accommodations. Thanks for sticking with me. I know a lot of this information is really dry. So first, what is a reasonable accommodation? Reasonable accommodation is a change, adaptation, or a modification to a policy, program, service, or workplace, which will allow a qualified person with a disability to participate fully in a program, take advantage of a service, or perform a job. Reasonable accommodations may include, for example, those which may be necessary in order for the person with a disability to use and enjoy a dwelling, including public and common use spaces. Since persons with disabilities may have unique needs due to their disabilities, in some cases, simply treating persons with disabilities exactly the same as others may not ensure that they will have equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. In order to show that a requested accommodation may be necessary, there must be an identifiable relationship or a nexus between requested accommodations. And again, what is reasonable must be determined on a case-by-case basis. However, there are some examples that are usually found to be reasonable accommodations and not undue hardship. So for example, a tenant with a mobility impairment who has difficulty walking might be provided a reasonable accommodation by being given an assigned accessible parking space in front of the entrance to his unit. Or a tenant with a mental disability who's afraid to leave her unit is provided a reasonable accommodation by being allowed to mail her rent payment. A tenant who uses a wheelchair and has difficulty picking up items off the ground might be allowed to have an assistance animal that fetches things for her as a reasonable accommodation to her disability. Or an older tenant who has a stroke and begins to use a wheelchair. Her apartment has steps at the entrance and she needs a ramp to enter the unit. She might be provided with construction of a ramp as a reasonable accommodation to the tenant's disability. So those are just some examples. So then how do you determine whether a request for a certain accommodation is reasonable? And this is very similar to the sort of analysis that went into the Navajo Nation Civil Rights Act. So whether a particular accommodation is reasonable depends on a variety of factors, which must be decided on a case-by-case basis. So the determination of whether a requested accommodation is reasonable depends on, first, does the request impose an undue financial and administrative burden on the housing provider? And then second, would making the accommodation require a fundamental alteration in the nature of the provider's operations? So if the answer to either of the question is yes, the requested accommodation is not reasonable. However, even where a housing provider is not obligated to provide a particular accommodation, because the particular accommodation is not reasonable, the provider is still obligated to provide other requested accommodations or alternative accommodations to the one initially requested that do qualify as reasonable. So for example, as a result of a disability, a tenant is unable to open the dumpster provided by his housing provider for his trash. The tenant requests that the housing provider send a maintenance staff person to collect trash from his apartment daily. Because the housing development is a small, low budget operation and the maintenance staff is not on site daily. In this example, it might be an undue financial or administrative burden for the housing provider to provide daily trash services to the tenant. The housing provider may then refuse to provide the requested accommodation. But the housing provider is still obligated to provide the tenant with a requested alternative accommodation, such as, for example, providing either with an open trash can or placing a trash can that the tenant can open in an accessible location so that the tenant may dispose of his trash. So remember, this is case by case, and it's important to communicate and work with individuals to see what their needs are and what you are able to provide. So what happens if providing a requested accommodation involves some costs on the part of the housing provider? Section 504 requires that in making an accommodation, a housing provider will be required to bear costs which do not amount to an undue financial administrative burden. So in application, this means that a housing provider may be required to spend money to provide legally required reasonable accommodations. Another example of this, a public housing agency receives a request to install a deadbolt lock on the front door of a unit higher up on the door for a resident whose child has autism. The request makes clear that the child can reach the deadbolt and may wander out of the unit if they're not able to follow instructions not to leave the unit because of their disability. So the public housing agency would then be required to pay for the cost of installing the deadbolt higher up on the door. Next on this is when and how should an individual request an accommodation? So an individual with a disability should request an accommodation as soon as it appears that the accommodation is needed. However, requests may still be made at any time. For example, requests may be made when an individual is applying for housing, entering into a lease, or occupying housing. Individuals who develop a disability during their tenancy may request accommodations even if they did not have a disability when they signed their lease. Section 504 does not prescribe a uniform procedure for requesting a reasonable accommodation to be used with all housing providers. And then to request an accommodation, an individual does not need to mention Section 504 or use the phrase reasonable accommodation. In general, a tenant or a prospective tenant should make clear to the housing provider that he or she is requesting that an exception, change, adjustment, or modification be made to a rule, policy, practice, or a service, building or dwelling unit because he or she has a disability. She or he should explain what the type of accommodation is requested and explain the relationship between the requested accommodation and his or her disability at Nexus. And then in order to facilitate the process and consideration of the request, tenants or prospective tenants may wish to check with the housing provider in advance to determine whether that housing provider has established any specific procedures regarding requests for reasonable accommodations. So as you all know, NHA has a policy and procedures for requesting reasonable accommodations. However, staff, it is important to recognize that individuals with disabilities might need assistance or accommodations in following those procedures, just as Cecilia and Hosky were both explaining. So just having these policies and procedures might not be sufficient. And then although Section 504 does not require it, it's usually helpful that the request be made in writing. So there will be documentation that the request was actually made in the event of a later dispute. So it's important to make sure requests are documented. So next is a housing provider obligated to provide an accommodation to a tenant or applicant if she or he has not requested it. The answer here is sometimes. Such a housing provider is obligated to provide an accommodation if he or she is on notice of the request. The provider already has reason to believe the accommodation is necessary, or if the need for the accommodation is obvious. So a person with a disability will be considered to have asked for an accommodation if he or she indicates that a change or exception to a policy, practice, procedure, or a modification would assist him or her in making more effective use of his or her housing, even if the words reasonable accommodation are not used as part of the request. And then sometimes the circumstances will dictate the need for accommodation. And remember, this is case by case again, but recognize if somebody is saying they didn't understand the procedures, was unable to read them, could not access them, or says anything with similar language, it's important for you as the staff to recognize where assistance can be made. Next, what happens if a housing provider fails to act on a request for an accommodation? So if a housing provider delays responding to a request for an accommodation after a reasonable amount of time, that delay may be construed as a failure to provide the reasonable accommodation. A tenant or applicant may choose then to seek legal assistance, file a grievance with NHA, or file a complaint with HUD. Last, may a housing provider suggest an alternative to the accommodation requested by an applicant or tenant? And yes, housing providers may suggest an alternative accommodation. However, the applicant or tenant may reject it if he or she feels it does not meet his or her needs. Because remember, the housing provider must grant the requested reasonable accommodation unless it constitutes an undue financial and administrative burden or fundamental alteration of the program. So housing providers and applicants should engage in an interactive process to determine the best approach to meeting the applicant or tenant's disability-related need. When considering a reasonable accommodation request, the housing provider should give primary consideration to the accommodation requested by the tenant or application, because the individual with a disability is most familiar with his or her disability and is in the best position to determine what type of aid or service will be effective. Okay, so I know that was a lot. I know it was super dry, felt like I was reading at you a lot. So thanks for sticking with me, but that's all I have. Hosky, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I just want to point out that in the Civil Rights Act for Individuals with Disabilities of 2018, and Austin talked about the Vocational Rehabilitation and Opportunities Act for the Handicapped, which superseded the Civil Rights Act, not superseded, but was in place before the Civil Rights Act, that the Vocational Rehabilitation Act basically did not have any remedies if the department or division or a business was discriminating against somebody with a disability in regards to site accessibility, reasonable accessibility, or denial of services due to a disability. It was written in the law, but there was no section in there saying what the consequences would be, the legal consequences. So the new law, the Civil Rights for Individuals with Disabilities Act of 2018, then put a section in there saying that, and Austin read that he can get remedy through the Navajo court system. At first, the Navajo Nation was arguing injunctive relief only, but on the other hand, people without disabilities were able to get monetary damages if they sued the Navajo Nation, maybe due to race or sex or whatever, but did not afford that same right to individuals with a disability. So it came down to where Navajos with disabilities, if they were discriminated against in one way or another, could then go and get monetary damages through the Navajo court system. So that's why that new law came into place, and other definitions were revised, and so now we have that 2018 Act that was signed by former President Russell Begay in 2018. So just want to add on to that. A lot of information, I know, but again, you can go back and view that in the on the website until we finish this. Next training we're going to have is with the Arizona NHA staff, and that's on the 22nd of February. And after that, then that will go up on the website for review, as far as looking at this, reviewing this webinar again. So will we go from with questions? Do we have any questions? Where are we at? About 11, go after 11? So
what we can do here, Hosky, there's the chat function where you can post questions if you have them, or the Q&A function, or if you raise your hand, at the bottom there's a raise hand button, and you'd like to ask a question verbally, then I can grant you permission to act, and then we will all be able to hear it. But I don't see any questions currently.
I guess we did a good job. Okay, we don't have anything, but we'll be getting out a training evaluation form, maybe tomorrow or Wednesday, and so that we like to some feedback on the training that we presented today, and get that out to the different staff members, or maybe through Matilda. So I guess, got anything else, Cecilia?
You might be muted, Cecilia.
Well, for me, I think you guys, we all covered everything there is to talk about. So I have nothing else to say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well then I guess we'll wrap up the training here. If you have any questions that you have, you can maybe send an email to myself or to Austin, and we can see if we can get an answer for you if you need something that you thought about after this training. So one thing, everybody, the NHA staff, I understand there's a new CEO that came on board, Maureen Curley. Looking forward to working with her also, and the rest of the NHA staff and Matilda Claw. So thank you very much, and we'll wrap it up here. Thank you.
Thank you.